Thank you very much, Trevor. Now, we're going to start with a short piece of film just to set the tone for everything that follows. Pink is the new black. So I trust we'll see you all in it, girls, next season, as has just been proposed. And there you have the equivalent of Miranda Priestley half a century before The Devil Wears Prada was even written. In this case, of course, she's called Maggie Prescott. It's interesting to note that they have the same initials, MP, both of them. And she is the editor of a magazine called Quality in Stanley Donen's 1957 film Funny Face, which some of you may know. And that's Kay Thompson playing her there. And if you're not familiar with the story, it's basically about a photographer, Dick Avery, who's based on Richard Avedon, who, together with Maggie, discovers a shy young girl who they take to Paris and make into the original supermodel, and that's played by Audrey Hepburn. So the key thing about this film, though, is there's a couple of lines from that song, Think Pink, which don't actually make it into the scene there, but are in the song. And they run, I would sing it for you, but I've got a cold. In pink, Madame would be forestarable. In pink, she'd be Harpers Bazaarable. And note that the magazine that's cited there is not Vogue, it's Harper's Bazaar, because of the woman we're going to be talking about tonight, who was its editor for a quarter of a century and who made it the most important magazine in terms of fashion throughout the world at the time, and that's this woman, Carmel Snow. Now, who was she? She was born in Dorking on Victoria Road, one of 6 children in 1887, and her parents were Peter and Annie White, and her father, Peter White, worked for an organisation called the Irish Woolen Manufacturing and Export Company. This was one of those organisations that had been set up to encourage indigenous industry and to sell Irish goods as far as possible overseas. And one of the key figures involved in that whole business was a woman called Ishbel, Lady Avedon. She was the wife of the Lord Lieutenant of the time, the Earl of Aberdeen. Here she is with her, in her viceregal dress with her 2 pages. That's Lord Killeen on her left, son of the Earl of Fingal, and Master Robert Arnott, son of Sir John Arnott, on the right. Lady Avedon was a great advocate of all things Irish and very keen to promote them as much as possible throughout the world. One of the other people who she also involved in this project to encourage Irish crafts and goods was Constance Spry, who some of you will know of, I hope, the great Constance Spry, who actually grew up here in Ireland and married a man in Castle Comer in County Kilkenny. And again, her Irish connections are now very sadly forgotten and overlooked. But modern flower arranging, not to mention haute cuisine in these islands, originated with Constance Spry, and she was, after all, the woman responsible for creating that somewhat dubious dish, coronation chicken, that we all occasionally have to eat during the summer months. Anyway, Lady Avedon also, as I say, backed Constance Spry in her early years, but she was very keen to help Peter White in his work. And therefore, when there arose the opportunity to have an Irish village at the 1893 Chicago World Fair, Lady Avedon seized on this as a great chance to present Ireland in the best possible light. And she asked Peter White to manage this. It was an extraordinary event, literally an Irish village, but it also somehow managed to include a miniature castle with a fake Blarney stone and a round tower and so on and so forth, all within it. But its primary function was to promote Irish goods and crafts. So Peter White was all set to do this, but literally a month before the exhibition opened, he fell sick, caught pneumonia, and died. So his wife, Annie, left a widow with 6 young children, the youngest of whom was only age 1, volunteered instead to take on the enterprise, and Lady Avedon accepted that she should do so. So Annie White travelled on her own to Chicago. She put all her 6 children into various homes. Carmel, aged 5 at the time, was placed with the Loretto nuns. And Annie went out to Chicago and managed the Irish village with huge aplomb and success in Chicago, to such a degree that she then decided to stay on in the United States, and gradually, one by one, her children came out to join her. Carmel came a year later with her elder sister, Christine, in 1894. And Annie White, with the closure of the Irish village, opened an Irish crafts shop in Chicago. And this also proved to be an enormous success. And then subsequently, she moved into fashion and to selling dresses for ladies. So one by one, her children spent their time coming over to America, but spending every summer here in Ireland with their aunts and uncles and cousins. So they never lost those Irish connections. So a lot of Carmel's summer childhoods were always spent, even though she was now based in America, spent here. Her mother's business was so successful in Chicago that ultimately one of the top fashion houses in New York, Fox's, the ladies who ran that, who were two sisters, invited Annie to come to New York and take over their business, which she did in 1904. So the family then moved, and that thereafter was really Carmel's base for the rest of her life. She was educated in the United States, but she was sent to a convent in Belgium to be finished when she was 17. So she and her sisters spent a year in Belgium. Then she was back in New York and had to find something to do. So here she is at the wedding of her elder brother Tom before the First World War, and this is Carmel looking not necessarily her best, but it's a photograph of her in her early 20s here, next to her brother, the groom, Tom White. Tom White subsequently became managing director of the whole Hearst publishing empire, and that'll be of relevance to us in due course. In the early 19-teens, 1910, 1911, Carmel decided to go to art school in New York. She very quickly discovered that, in fact, although she had a terrific eye, she had no other talent. She couldn't draw or paint very successfully. But she caught the eye of one of her teachers, Robert Henry, who was also, oddly enough, the teacher of Edward Hopper. And he painted her at that time in 1911. This is her portrait. It's called Portrait in Rose and Grey, Miss Carmel White. It's a kind of sub-Whistlerian picture, but it gives you an idea of what Carmel was like. And already she was making an impact in New York. You have to remember, obviously, there are two disadvantages that the Whites suffered from. They were Irish and Roman Catholic, and New York was not very keen on either of those, New York society at the time. And of course, her mother was in trade, which was considered a great disadvantage, because before the First War, Carmel became engaged to a young man called Arthur Fitzpatrick. His father was Sir Charles Fitzpatrick, who was Solicitor General of Canada and Lieutenant Governor of Quebec. And everything seemed to go swimmingly. She was invited up to Canada to meet her fiancé's family, until she mentioned that her mother had a dress shop, at which point the engagement was summarily called off. By this stage, her mother's business was doing so enormously well that she moved further uptown to East 57th Street, where she bought a mansion for almost $250,000, an enormous amount of money to be spent at the time. But it gives you an idea of how business was conducted at the time. There's a description in the New York Times of the premises in which it says, "People will pass the house and never know that the gowns of the richly dressed women they pass in Fifth Avenue are being made inside." So the whole business was run as though a lady was simply dropping in on another friend into a smart house. There were no signs outside, no shop windows, nothing like this. You called by to Annie White, and her staff would find you the right clothes. Now, those clothes, how they were made, are very interesting for the period. There was no, so to speak, indigenous American fashion industry at the time. What would happen is that people such as Annie White would go to Paris twice a year to see the collections, and they were allowed to buy a certain number of items from key couturiers like Paul Poiret or the Caillot sisters and so forth. They then brought those back and basically reproduced them, took out the labels and copied the designs, and then sold them to their American clients. And everybody understood that's the nature of the business. that basically there were no designers as such in the United States, but nor did American clients want that to be so. They wanted Paris clothes. They just didn't want the inconvenience of having to go to Paris for them. So Annie White and her like would go to Paris, would see the clothes, would make sketches of various items, let's say buy a certain number of them, and then that would be the starting point to produce a collection for their own clients in turn. And it instilled, Carmel began to go with her mother to Paris, and it instilled in her two things: a great love of Paris itself, and also a passion for French fashion, which never left her thereafter. For a long time, particularly in the post-war period, there were high import duties on French clothes. You were not supposed to bring French clothes into the United States unless you paid duty on them. You may remember that when Jacqueline Kennedy was First Lady, she ran into trouble in the same respect, that there was an outcry that she was wearing French clothes when she should have been wearing American ones, and that she wasn't declaring this as well. She did what Carmel Snow had already done, which is that Carmel Snow, every time she took a boat back home to America, would sit in her cabin unstitching the labels of the French designers off the clothes, so that if she was stopped at customs, she could say, no, they're American. Look, there are no French labels on anything. And there is a story that she went to Paris for her honeymoon, and while there, her new husband bought her a pearl ring, and again, not wishing to pay import duty on it, she unscrewed the pearl off the top of it before they got into New York. Anyway, come the First World War, ultimately she got to Paris, where she became head of all female personnel in the Irish Red Cross after being there for only a matter of months. And this gave an indication of her organizational abilities and how exceptionally talented she was at taking control and supervising large numbers of people, and this would stand her in good stead. But when the First War ended, she came back to New York again and found herself once more in her mother's dress shop, and was very unsatisfied with this arrangement and tried to see if she could find a way out. And ultimately she did, when this man offered her a job in 1920. This is Conde Nast. You will all know Conde Nast Publishing Empire. What you may not realize is that he was a real person called Conde Nast. That was his name. And Conde Nast was a publisher of genius in the late 19th, early 20th century. And in 1909, he bought a not very successful fashion magazine which had been started by a group of Ivy League graduates called Vogue, and he transformed it into the great beast that it has been globally ever since. And he invited Carmel Snow, recognizing her talents, he invited her to join his staff as an editorial assistant in 1920. Now, Vogue at this time was run by a formidable woman called Edna Chase, who really edited Vogue and ran the whole office there in the same way that Carmel's mother ran her dress shop. That is, as though it was a very genteel business, so that visitors, for example, who called into Vogue would walk into effectively what appeared to be a drawing room, and there was a nice girl sitting behind a Chippendale desk who'd invite her to come and take a seat, and so forth. So it was all very genteel, and you'd hardly know that you were in the publishing business because, that wasn't quite seemly, especially for the kind of young girls who were coming into it. So it was all done in a very respectful and tasteful fashion, and to some extent this began to irk Carmel very early. But nevertheless, she learned a great deal, and she quickly rose to become effectively fashion editor under Mrs. Chase at the period. Now here's a photograph of her, taken in Conde Nast's apartment in 1929 by a young English photographer who was making his first visit to New York at the time, and his name was Cecil Beaton. And Cecil Beaton was very keen to get on in the United States. He recognized the enormous potential the country had, and to get work in publications there, not least Vogue. And one of his first advocates was indeed Carmel White, and he wrote of her in his diary at the time that she looked like a fox terrier, and that she has the most satisfactorily ordered life he'd ever seen. And 27 years later, again in his diary, he reminded himself of that earlier encounter and said, "She's never lost her innate enthusiasm and lettuce crisp enjoyment. She's an inspiration." This is something that many other people would say about her. Now, someone with whom she worked in this period, and indeed someone again who greatly admired her, was this photographer, who you may know, Edward Steichen, one of the great early 20th century photographers in the United States. And he had initially engaged in other forms of photography. He'd never done fashion photography until he came to work for Vogue, which he did because he needed the money after a rather expensive marriage breakdown. And he was offered work at Vogue, so he came to work there, and he worked with Carmel. And he said, when I started making photographs for Vogue, I had a great deal to learn about fashion. So I've always felt grateful to Carmel for the real interest she showed in fashion photography and for her invaluable assistance at fashion sittings. Like many other people, he would say that a great deal that he learned was courtesy of working with her. Now, by the end of the 1920s, Carmel had just turned 40, and she had got married. And she married this man, Palance Snow. And all the jokes about white marrying Snow have been made in the past, so we needn't repeat them on this occasion. And he was a true wasp, very much part of that Upper East Side New York society, with a place up in the countryside also, keen on hunting, shooting, fishing, all the correct country pursuits, everything that his wife wasn't. But nevertheless, it turned out to be a terrifically successful partnership, and they had a strange relationship. An indication of how things would go was when he proposed to her. He sent her a telegram which said, "May I sail on the Mauretania with you? Reply paid." That was it. She responded in a telegram, "Reply accepted." And before the Mauretania sailed, they duly got married. They went, as I've already mentioned, to Paris for their honeymoon, her favourite city, and they went on to have 3 daughters. And I had the good fortune, over 20 years ago, to meet the youngest of those daughters, who was then still alive, Bridget. She and I had lunch together in Michael's in Midtown, which some of you may know, a terrific restaurant there. And she was fascinating, talking about her mother, who had been the original career woman. Carmel had 3 daughters. She'd worked through all her pregnancies. She'd spent very short times with any of them. She was a good mother, it's not to say she wasn't. Here she is with her eldest daughter, actually, the firstborn, Carmel. But her career was very important to her, and she never stopped working. And she never took particular interest in the areas of interest to her husband, the country pursuits and so forth that her husband did. She was very much, as I say, the 20th century career woman. And in fact, curiously enough, she was still recovering in hospital after giving birth to Bridget in 1932, when she received a visit from a man who would really decide her destiny thereafter. And it was this man, and this is William Randolph Hearst, the great William Randolph Hearst, with whom you're all familiar, because, again, he had the great rival publishing empire, Hearst magazines and newspapers and so forth. And he was very much a dominant force throughout the 20th century in publishing, and Hearst continues to be so in many ways. He had a magazine at the time called Harpers Bazaar, which was older than Vogue. In fact, this year it celebrates its 150th anniversary, Harpers Bazaar, but it hadn't been doing so well, and he recognised that Carmel Snow had the imagination, had the flair, had the verve to turn it around and make it a serious competitor to Vogue. So he invited her to take the job. They had a what would be described as a feisty relationship all their life. Here she is, Carmel. You can see her here, as always, with a glass in her hand. We'll come back to that later. At a party in San Simeon, his great mansion in California. And here is his famous mistress, Marion Davis, and Charlie Chaplin here. So she did spend time with Hearst, but they clashed. They were both very strong-minded, willful people. So much so that on one occasion, Hearst sent round an internal memo in the building saying, "Does anyone have any control over Mrs. Snow? I know I don't." And here's a typical incident to give you an idea of the nature of their relationship. In 1936, Carmel Snow learnt that an American divorcee in London called Wallace Simpson was seeing the Prince of Wales. She therefore arranged for the photographer George Heunigen-Hewen, with whom she often worked, to go over to London to photograph Mrs. Simpson for Harpers Bazaar. He did so, he came back, and when he stepped off the boat, Hearst, who'd also heard about this, got hold of the photographs first because he wanted to publish them in his newspapers. And what next happened is that Carmel Snow appeared at his door, and as his secretary subsequently said, the door swung open. In came Mrs. Snow like a little Irish firecracker. She marched straight into the chief's private office, and when she came out, she had the photographs in her hand. They didn't appear in Hearst newspapers. They duly appeared in Harper's Bazaar with the discreet but knowing caption, Mrs. Ernest Simpson, the most famous American in London, wears a Chinese dinner dress. And that was enough for everybody to know exactly what was going on. And here is a not very good reproduction of that Heunigen-Hewen dress and photograph that appeared duly in Harper's Bazaar, and that was the first Americans could guess about what was going on the other side of the Atlantic. Now, as I say, she moved really because, despite the fight with Hearst all her life, she recognized that she was given more opportunity by him than she would have been had she stayed at Vogue. Interestingly, Conde Nast never spoke to her again. He refused to have anything to do with her after she left. And when he heard that she had quit, for the second time in his life, he got drunk. Weirdly enough, the first time was on the night of his honeymoon. But he never drank otherwise, Conde Nast. And her former editor, Edna Chase, wrote to her that her defection had killed in my heart an affection and a faith that nothing but your own words could have destroyed. Vogue found it unforgivable that Carmel could have left. But she did the right thing. She saw an opportunity, and here she is, that little Irish firecracker, and she took it absolutely and made the most of it. And as a result of that move, she made Harper's Bazaar the most successful and the most famous fashion magazine in the world for the next 25 years. Here she is in her favourite city, Paris, with Mamboche, who some of you will know, the first American couturier to open in Paris, where he had a hugely successful business. Curiously enough, he was the man responsible for dressing Mrs. Simpson for much of her life, and her wedding dress and most of her trousseau was made by Mamboche. And he was a close friend, as many designers indeed were, of Carmel Snow. So here she is having a meeting with him in Paris. Here she is. She never stopped working. Notoriously, she scarcely needed any sleep. She was up at 5, 6 in the morning, already on the phone, already starting with ideas and so forth. But here she is having a lunch meeting in Paris with her staff. There you see her, there. And just to show she never stopped, here she is having her hair done by Guillaume, the most famous hairdresser in Paris at the time, while her secretary takes notes from her. This extraordinary device to curl her hair being used there. This again is in the 1930s. And here she is, because she oversaw every detail, overseeing a shoot. Here's Carmel, overseeing a shoot again from 1937, and this is George Heunigen-Hewen, I should say, a fantastic Scandinavian photographer and one of the great photographers from the 1930s and 40s. And she did have that ability to draw all the best people to her and encourage them to stay and work with her thereafter. In Paris, one of the people she got to work with her was this woman, Daisy Fellows. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the Honourable Daisy Fellows. Her mother had been one of the Singer family, that is the sewing machine heiresses. Her father was the Duc de Casse. And she was famous for being, certainly within Paris, the most stylish woman of her generation. To be honest, I would say she took second place to Mona Williams, of whom I'm sure you all know, as the most stylish woman in the world. When designers around the world in the 1930s were asked to name the most stylish woman in the world, Mona Williams came first, but Daisy Fellows was on the list as well. And here she is wearing one of her famous Tutti Frutti necklaces designed for her by Cartier. She was a strange woman, just to give you a hint of Daisy Fellows. Again, she was extraordinarily well connected, but she wasn't necessarily a terribly nice person. She said of her three daughters, said, the eldest, Emmeline, is like my first husband, only a great deal more masculine. The second one, Isabel, is like me, but without the guts. And the third, Jacqueline, was the result of a horrible little man called Leishman. She was also famous for organising dinner parties of people who didn't like each other. Anyway, but she was a name, and the crucial thing is that Carmel got her to become, in the pre-war years, the Paris editor of Harpers Bazaar. And having the Honourable Daisy Fellows on your masthead was, again, another great coup. Here is Carmel in her office some years later in New York at work. And the key figure we want to notice is this gentleman kneeling on the floor here. This is Alexei Ivanovitch. Alexei Ivanovitch was perhaps the greatest graphic designer of the 20th century. Russian-born, had come to New York in the years after the Revolution, had worked in Philadelphia teaching design until he met Carmel Snow. And she said, I saw a fresh new conception of layout technique that struck me like a revelation. Pages that bled beautifully, cropped photographs, typography and design that were bold and arresting. Within 10 minutes, I'd asked Brodovich to have cocktails with me, and that evening I signed him to a contract as art director. And again, for the rest of her time at Harpers Bazaar, the two of them worked very closely together. Between them, they completely redefined magazines and what they looked like. The whole of editorial design was overthrown by them. Not least, they loved the notion of empty space, of whiteness on pages, of lack of clutter, of clean typography, of unexpected but very striking cropping, and strange, again, imaginative juxtaposition, plus a constant interaction between the text and the pictures. And to give you an idea, let's just look at a few examples. First of all, some Harper's Bazaar covers. And look how clean they are. If you look at fashion magazine covers today, you'll see they're busy, they're terribly busy, they're endless things shouting at you. Now compare them with these designs. This is June 1940, the cover in June 1940. It does everything you need. April 1946. June 1950. September 1958. You can see how striking these were and how unlike anything that had ever been done before or indeed since. And again, a couple of pages from interiors of the magazine, just to give you an idea. This is a Madame Grey dress, and notice how the text, the sinuosity of the text, emulates the sinuosity of the line of the dress. And that's from 1935. Terrific. Using Hearst newspapers, ripped open, with girls stepping out from them. That's from 1938. And then, very frequently, this overlay, a very common Brodovich design, from 1950, for a page about nails. And again, notice the interaction between text and pictures. Nobody had done anything like this before, so it was completely revolutionary. Now, here's a cover from March 1943, and I wonder if you recognise the model. Lauren Bacall, exactly. This was her first cover. She was only aged 18 at the time, and she was just beginning as a model when she was discovered and used for this cover of Harper's Bazaar. As I say, it was her first modelling outing. And here's another picture from the same period, the same year, 1943, another film star being prepared for a shoot, Rita Hayworth. And you can see Carmel again, overseeing the shoot here, keeping an eye on what's going on and making sure it's done just to her satisfaction. Again, Hoynigan-Hewen was responsible for this photograph too. Now, obviously, during those war years, Europe was inaccessible to America. But the very moment that Paris was liberated, she was on the first boat and plane there. She was the first fashion journalist to get back in to Paris. And here she is setting off on a plane. This is a woman now in her late 50s, heading off to Paris to cover the fashions and to report back to everybody. And from this time onwards, she started also to do radio broadcasts from Paris to give people details of what they could expect from the fashion shows. And also it helped to promote, naturally, Harpers Bazaar. Everything she did was based around the concept of helping to promote Harpers Bazaar. I've already mentioned how tireless she was. She slept very little. She worked a great deal. Her work was her passion. It was her life, and when she lost it, it was really a very sad end for her. Those broadcasts were enormously important and popular, and very much the occasion when women all over the United States gathered around the radio, and she would prepare very meticulously for them, as she did for every issue of the magazine. Here she is at that time, sitting up in bed. That's Marie-Louise Bousquet, who was her then fashion editor in Paris, and they're looking at page proofs. One of the things about Mrs. Snow, she always wore her pearls. She never didn't appear in pearls. There are stories of people coming in and she's in her bath, all made up, but wearing nothing except her pearls. At all times she wore her pearls. And her hair, by this stage it had gone white, so it was dyed lavender. So she always had this lavender tint to her hair thereafter. It was Marie-Louise Bousquet who introduced her to this man. This is Christian Dior, who had just started his fashion house in late 1946 and who had his first fashion show in February 1947, at which Carmel was present. And you'll be familiar with the Dior look, that great full skirt and so forth. And it was Carmel Snow who came up with the name The New Look. At that show she said, "Oh, but this is the new look," and so it was christened thereafter. So she was responsible, again, for helping to launch Dior's career. And here she is with him. They're judging a competition, a fashion design competition at Parsons School in Paris, the outlet of Parsons House in Paris. She admired Dior, she was close to him, she worked with him, she was very upset when he died 10 years later. But the man who she admired more than anybody was this is Cristobal Balenciaga. There's been an exhibition, a Balenciaga exhibition in the Victoria and Albert Museum in the last few months, which has really not done him justice, to be honest. It should have been a better show than is actually the case. Balenciaga was perhaps the greatest, the most austere, the most severe, the most demanding fashion designer of the 20th century, and Carmel Snow absolutely worshipped him. So much so that he actually designed a suit for her, a suit with a wide scoop neck, just a cropped jacket and a skirt, and she wore it thereafter for the rest of her life. She wore it in every fabric, in every colour. She wore the same suit. She was laid out for her funeral in one of her Balenciaga suits, and she was thrilled because it was her suit, and he'd made it for her. Here are the two of them together. There was much gossip in Paris because it was felt that Mrs. Snow had fallen hopelessly in love with Balenciaga. Who knows whether that was or wasn't the case, but certainly she recognised his remarkable and indeed unique talent. And it's interesting that Chanel said of Balenciaga that he was the only couturier in the truest sense of the word. The others are simply fashion designers. Chanel was not known for saying kind things about anybody. But here is Chanel with Carmel Snow in Carmel Snow's apartment in New York. Again, the two women knew each other very well. And Carmel Snow had come across Chanel very early. Her sister, Christine, had come back from Paris during the war with some clothes, including an incredibly simple shift dress with a rabbit fur collar, and she wore it with lots of strings of fake pearls. And immediately Carmel recognised this as being something extraordinary. On the other hand, her mother, Annie White, disapproved of it. My mother declared flatly that her good money might as well have been thrown away. She simply couldn't understand the Chanel aesthetic because she belonged to a previous generation. But of course Carmel Snow did, and therefore they worked closely together, as indeed she did with this man, the great illustrator of the period, Christian Babymare, who some of you will know, I'm sure, his work, the greatest illustrator of the middle of the 20th century. And if you're ever in Paris, by the way, and some people don't necessarily know this, on the Champs-Élysées, there's still the Guerlain premises. Blag your way in there to the first floor because the walls are all decorated. They're all painted by Bérard, the first floor walls. They were private rooms for clients there, and mostly they're closed off. But if you can get up to see Bérard's extraordinary decoration of Guerlain, it's well worth doing so. Who next? Here she is, as I say, working away. She always, with Brodovitch, laid out the pages for every issue on the floor. And then they worked through them and sometimes moved them around in that very old-fashioned way. I've mentioned how many people she discovered over the course of her life or helped to promote. And this is another one. This, of course, is Diana Vreeland, who would subsequently, in the 1960s, become a very famous editor of Vogue and then the first director of the Costume Museum in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Carmel Snow had met in passing Diana Vreeland over the years, but one evening in 1935, she saw Diana Vreeland wearing Chanel, actually, and dancing at a dinner in the St. Regis Club. And the following morning, she offered her a job at Harpers Bazaar. She recognised that this woman had extraordinary flair and taste. And, of course, one of Vreeland's great innovations was the column Why Don't You, which she ran in Harper's Bazaar, which was much mocked because it had things like why don't you wash your children's hair in flat champagne like the French do? This, by the way, was still the Depression era. Here are the two women at a fashion show together, so that's Vreeland obviously on the left and our heroine Carmel Snow on the right. Now, somebody else who she discovered is seen here in the middle of a fashion shoot, again being supervised by Carmel Snow. And it's this man, the younger man here, Richard Avedon, a terrific photographer. I'm sure all of you will be familiar with his work. And here he is going through layout of pages with Alexei Brodovitch for an issue. Now, Richard Avedon was still in his early 20s when he met Brodovitch, who then introduced him to Carmel Snow, and he very quickly became the principal photographer of this period at Harper's Bazaar. Here's a photograph taken by Louise Dahl-Wolff of Richard Avedon with Carmel and with the two most famous models of the period. They were sisters, Dorian Leigh and Susie Parker. Susie Parker, you may have seen in that little film snippet, the gorgeous red hair with the wonderful rippling hair, that was Susie Parker. And Dorian Leigh was the inspiration for Holly Golightly. Truman Capote knew her well, found her particular lifestyle fascinating, and therefore used her as the inspiration, as I say, for Holly Golightly. I'm going to mention Truman Capote again in a minute, but here is again Marie-Louise Bousquet and Carmel and Richard Avedon at a fashion show. And here he is yet again, once more, Mrs. Snow working from her bed in Paris, wearing her pearls and being assisted by Richard Avedon while they worked into the night. And when Funny Face was made, Richard Avedon advised Fred Astaire on how to play a photographer. So here's a still showing the two of them on set in Paris at the time. I mentioned Truman Capote already. Breakfast at Tiffany's was actually supposed to appear in its entirety in one of the 1958 issues of Harper's Bazaar. It had been commissioned by Carmel Snow, and the layout was prepared. And it was at that point that she was fired, and her successor, who I'll mention shortly, lost her nerve because of Holly Golightly's slightly risque way of life, and perhaps some of the language was a little too fruity, and therefore it was pulled. And Truman Capote never forgave Harper's Bazaar, never forgave Hearst for doing that, and actually remained a very loyal friend thereafter of Carmel Snow. And he's just one of a large number of writers who were published. Famously, Carmel Snow said she didn't just want to appeal to the well-dressed woman, she wanted to appeal to the well-dressed mind. And everybody from Evelyn Waugh to W.H. Jordan to Colette to Virginia Woolf were all published in the pages of Harper's Bazaar. Carson McCullough, who was a great friend of Truman Capote, her novelette, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, that was also published in its entirety, first in an issue of Harper's Bazaar. So it gives you an idea of the standard. It wasn't just visual, but also literary, that Carmel constantly worked to. Now, I've mentioned that she, as a young woman, had spent her summers in Ireland, and she remained very loyal to Ireland and never forgot the country. Here's a photograph of her with her many white siblings and offspring and so forth in Ireland in the mid-1930s when they all came back. And she always came back and forth to Ireland, and she did so particularly in the early 1950s when she launched the career of this woman, who you will all know, Sybil Connolly. Now, the late Sheila Dunsany, another wonderful, dynamic woman, I remember going to see her when she was in a nursing home in Clane, shortly before she died, actually. So she told me how this had all come about. She had already seen Sybil and bought clothes from her when Sybil was working at Richard Allen's on Grafton Street. That was in 1951. In 1952, Sheila went to stay with Henry McElhenney, who then owned Glenveigh, the Glenveigh estate up in Donegal, but who was based in Philadelphia. So she went to stay with him, and she took a lot of clothes, Irish-made clothes, including quite a few pieces which had been made by Sybil with her. And these were much admired, and then she went to New York, and they were admired there. She met Carmel Snow, who asked her, and she explained there was this Irish designer called Sybil Connolly who was producing them. So Carmel, on her way to France, insisted that the entire American fashion press come via Ireland and spent a few days here, staying in the Shelburne Hotel. And they went out to Dunsany Castle, where a fashion show was put on for them by Sheila, showing just Sybil's clothes. And that was the launch of Sybil's career. Within 2 months, she was in New York, making her debut there. Within 6 months, she was on the cover of Life magazine. And really, it's thanks to Sheila and to Carmel Snow that her career began, because Carmel Snow was so insistent, not just everybody from Harper's Bazaar, but everybody from every fashion publication going to Paris came to Dublin first, and that's why Sybil's career took off the way it did, particularly in the United States. The other person who helped her, and it's just worth a mention, again is somebody else who Carmel Snow knew very well, and that's this woman, Eleanor Lambert, who was the great fashion publicist in New York for much of the 20th century. Now, I knew Eleanor later, in her older age. She was over 100 when she eventually died. She and Sybil became very close friends immediately, and she would come over every year and stay in the muse of Sybil's house on Marion Square. And that's how I got to know Eleanor. And Eleanor started the International Best Dressed list, which still goes on. Vanity Fair, since her death, Vanity Fair have taken it over. And in the 90s, I was on the judging committee for 2 years of that Best Dressed list. Again, thanks to Sybil and thanks to Eleanor Lambert. So I never met Carmel Snow, unfortunately. It was before my time, but I met her daughter, I met Eleanor, I met many people associated with her. So I got to know her very well. And I got to know, particularly through her daughter, the horror that happened to her when, out of the blue, in 1958, she was told that her job was ending, that her time was up and she was being let go. Now, at this stage, she was 70. So you can understand why perhaps people thought it was time to ease up. But there was another problem, and that was, unfortunately, that she was drinking too much. And there was some uncertainty of how sure she was of her job and how good she would continue to be at editing. The real blow was that the person appointed to succeed her was one of her nieces, Nancy White, who had hitherto been editing Good Housekeeping. Now, Good Housekeeping is a perfectly fine magazine, but it certainly wasn't Harper's Bazaar. And she felt this was a huge insult to her, much as she loved and admired her niece. So it was a great blow to her when she was removed from the position. You know, it's said all political careers end in failure, but so frequently do all fashion careers end in the same way. She and her husband decided to move to Ireland, and they bought this place, Rockfleet, otherwise known as Rossovera, which is near Newport in County Mayo. And they moved there thinking this would be where they settled, but they didn't last a year. To be honest, the isolation, the climate, the lack of interconnection with people, she'd become so accustomed to city life, they sold it very quickly. Some of you may know it. It was subsequently bought and is still owned by his children, by Walter Curley, the late American ambassador to Ireland. So I knew it when Walter and his family used to live there. I used to go to drinks parties there. And the connection with Carmel was another wonderful thing to know. So then her husband, Palance, finally died. She lingered on, but not for terribly long, in New York. She was very much yesterday's woman, and again, Truman Capote tells this story of how in smart restaurants, whereas before she'd have been given the best table, now she was shunted off into a corner next to the kitchen doors, and she felt it very deeply. So she felt more and more, even though she was back in New York, she lived much more in a much more isolated way. Here she is, that's one of her sisters, and there she is, looking like remnants of the Ancien Regime after the revolution had occurred. Her moment had passed, so she died very soon afterwards in her sleep in 1961. It was a sad end to what had been a fantastically successful life and career, and it's often asked why she wasn't better remembered. And I think one of the reasons was because she just preceded television. Diana Vreeland was a natural on television. Carmel Snow was great on radio, but she preceded television, and as a result, there are no television clips of her. She just preceded that whole fame game, and she's insufficiently understood and appreciated as a result. But let's just finish. I started with that film clip because Kay Thompson in it really embodies, indeed plays, the spirit of Carmel Snow. And if you remember the lines from that, now I wouldn't ever presume to tell a woman what a woman ought to think, but tell her if she's got to think pink. Thank you very much.